It's been nearly 4 years since COVID-19 rocked the world and upended the lives of nearly everyone across the globe. But in all that time, in some ways, we're still just as in the dark as we were at the beginning when this whole mess started. As Alina Chan, author of Viral, The Search for the Origins of COVID-19, put it, we are 4 years into the pandemic and still no national commission to investigate the origin of COVID. Communications with the Wuhan lab have not been subpoenaed, intel not declassified, despite the COVID-19 Origin Act of 2023. Now, at the center of the firestorm into the origins of COVID-19 is EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit group involved in high-risk coronavirus research in China, may have lied about risky behavior involved in that research. Joining us today to discuss EcoHealth Alliance and the origins of COVID-19 is Alina Chan. Thank you so much for being with us, Alina. Thanks for having me on. So I just saw a tweet on X that I think perfectly encapsulates this, and I see this periodically, often I think from people who are the people who are most inclined to still alter their behavior due to COVID, who are still wearing masks in public and that kind of thing, will be the ones most likely to express the sentiment. I don't understand this. Maybe you can fill me in, that it doesn't really matter whether COVID, where it came from, whether a lab or an animal origin, that it doesn't have policy implications. I find that attitude baffling. Have you encountered that out in the wild?
Yes, I think there's a cycle of this every few months, is that people would say, oh, why does it matter? Why should we find out how this pandemic started? And I think it just reflects their lack of thinking it through. Because currently both the wildlife trade and research on live pathogens is proliferating. And unless we find the origin of COVID-19, it's hard to convince any government around the world to put in the full manpower and resources to regulate and curb these activities.
Right, and if it's, I just want to know the truth. If it's an animal origin, then fine, we should think through what policies would prevent this from happening again. And if it's, directly or indirectly the responsibility of the U.S. government or the Chinese government, that, research that we paid for, that they conducted, had something to do with that. I mean, of course, like the moral toll, maybe even apart from the policy implications, is staggering, because this did affect millions of people globally, millions of deaths. And to not want to know more about that, I find so confusing. And yet, as I think you've talked about a lot recently, our U.S. policymakers don't seem so keen to investigate this. Even when we signed a disclosure, President Biden signed it, that he would let us know all the information the federal government has about COVID's origins. We still didn't get that.
Yes, I think that was the most shocking turn of events this past year, is that even though a bill passed in both the Senate and House unanimously, so all of them agreed that all of this intel concerning the Wuhan lab and the origin of COVID should be declassified, and it was signed into law by President Biden, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence still declined to declassify that information. So I think we're now 4 years into the pandemic. What is needed so that we can see that intel?
How does this not investigating the origins, that is, put us at a greater risk for potential future pandemics, if at all?
I think there's this impasse that's happening right now. It is that those who argue against a lab leak and blame it entirely on the wildlife trade, they're not willing to move forward on new regulations, like true, real actions that could provide more global oversight over this type of work. So unless you show them evidence that this most likely started in a lab, it's very difficult to push for new change.
What intelligence, do you have any guesses or hunches, having researched and done so much reporting on this, intelligence that, for instance, the Energy Department could have that led it to reach a conclusion that was different from other agencies? I, for my part, wonder if they know more about reporting that appeared in the Wall Street Journal and a couple other places, that the earliest patients of COVID or a COVID-like disease the earliest infections were actually in the lab of those three scientists. If they, that's a pretty definitive smoking gun if that could be shown, and I wonder if the Energy Department has that information.
So I do believe that experts at the DOE and other intelligence agencies have had access to this intelligence regarding the sick Wuhan lab workers. And based on what I've heard, I feel fairly confident that those names that were reported by the Wall Street Journal are accurate. So these are the scientists who work most closely on the genetic engineering of SARS-like viruses in that lab in Wuhan. And so It's not a smoking gun, but it surely is consistent with a possible lab origin of COVID-19. So everything that we know now is circumstantial, whether for a wildlife origin or for a lab origin, but we do have a clear path for a virus collected from nature to be altered in the lab and to have leaked in that city.
We Go ahead, Jessica.
I've worked in the research space before. There's kind of a sentiment that you want the public to generally like the research you're doing or have an appreciation for research. Is there a sentiment you think in the molecular biology community or virology research community that they don't want the public to be fearful of this kind of research, and a lab leak might make people very fearful of this research, so much so that there would be public pressure to end funding for this kind of research?
Yes, that's true. So I do think that some scientists have these conflicts of interest in that if it is found that the pandemic was started because of scientific research and it's killed tens of millions of people, hurt the global economy, cost trillions of dollars. Now there are some 65 million people estimated to have long COVID, and so many mental health issues coming from pandemic. If all of this arose because of this specific class of research that is focused on finding new viruses in nature and modifying them in labs, yes, it's reasonable that a large number of people in the public would strongly advocate against this and cut funding for it. And so I think there's no way around it. But rather than be afraid of investigating, what they should be doing is showing that they are accountable, that they're transparent, and that they can investigate lab-based outbreaks. This is how to move forward in the future. It's not to suppress investigation, but to show that you are trustworthy.
And yet we're still learning new information week after week that I think erodes confidence, erodes trust in the scientific gatekeepers, the people who were filing for grants to do this kind of research. It just emerged the other week. I believe it was Dr. Barrick, one of the foremost advocates of gain of function, and it's shown that behind closed doors, when they're talking about their proposal to do gain of function research, and they admit in their notes, they say, let's not make it sound like this research is going to be done in China. After we've got the money, after we've got the approval, then we can actually do a lot of it in Wuhan. But we're not going to tell them that's what they're doing. Can you talk to us about that really amazing disclosure we saw last week?
Yes, so this was an organization called the U.S. Right to Know. And so they are the one organization that's been filing so many Freedom of Information Act requests against the NIH, against scientists involved in this type of work, to try and find out what happened in Wuhan in the year leading up to the pandemic. And so what they found this time from emails from early 2018 is that the EcoHealth Alliance, which is a New York-based nonprofit, had written a proposal sent to the Department of Defense asking for millions of dollars to do some of this novel coronavirus research work. And it involved partners from Wuhan as well as in the US, in North Carolina. And in this early draft of the proposal, they had said that all these virus experiments with genetic engineering will be done in North Carolina. But in the footnote, in a comment that EcoHealth Alliance left on that document, it said, we'll just tell DARPA, we'll just tell the Defense Department that we're going to do this work in North Carolina. But once we get money, we'll redelegate them. And I believe a lot of the work can be done in Wuhan as well. And they said they were going to play up the US side of it and downplay the Chinese part of it so that it wouldn't be seen as a negative by the Department of Defense. And elsewhere in that document, there was also another comment by the virologist from North Carolina saying that this sort of work is typically done at higher biosafety in the US. In China, they do it low biosafety. A lot of US virologists would freak out if they knew.
Incredible.
So it sounds like if the research community, there's some sentiment of them not wanting folks to be skeptical of gain of function research. Is there a path for the investigation of COVID origins to come through government-funded research and directly hired researchers if the private universities aren't going to fund it?
So just to clarify, do you mean is there a path to continue this type of research, or is there a path to investigate?
Excuse me.
So if the researchers are not, willing to fund some kind of research to investigate COVID origins to an extent where it's conclusive, do you see a path for the government to potentially fund the research directly?
Yes, so I firmly believe that there's a way for the US government to investigate. In fact, much of the evidence that's been unearthed so far have been outside of China. So these are documents or exchanges in emails sent from Wuhan scientists to collaborators outside of China, so including the US. So unfortunately, most of this evidence has been unearthed by internet sleuths or independent scientists and journalists or swimming against the current this past 4 years. And there is an incredible amount of it, but so far, that's really the tip of the iceberg. We've only seen some few exchanges, and especially not the ones in late 2018 and 2019, the 2 years right before the pandemic. Those are the exchanges we need to see. And the government here in the US has the ability to subpoena, has the ability to extract these from the US collaborators of the Wuhan lab. And so far, they have not done it. Like, just imagine if we had done this in 2020. We would have found out everything we know today and likely a lot more.
Dr. Chan, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.